Hello again everyone, welcome back to another episode of Sacrificing Exchange like a Grandmaster. Today we'll dive deep into the world number 5 and that is Maxime Vachier Lagrave. He's one of the top Grandmasters that sacrifices more exchange, probably more than anybody in the field right now. If anything, Magnus Carlsen will come on par, but that will be another video. But for today's video, I've prepared, in my opinion, 5 of his best game that features exchange sacrifices. So feel free to follow along, pause the video if you wanted to, and if you haven't already, take a look at the video that I've made previously about sacrificing exchange, as I'll be using some of the reference from there. But the first game that we will have is from Maxime when he was playing in the French Championship just about 14 years ago. It is quite difficult not to include this masterpiece from MVL, as this has been arguably one of Maxime's immortal game right here. In this position, Robert, his opponent, plays pawn takes e5, and after pawn takes e5, initiating a queen trade, we instead see bishop to a3 from Robert, trying to attack the rook here on f8. Now if you wanted to, you can pause the video right here to see what Maxime actually played and what his ideas were. I'll give you a couple of seconds. In this position, he plays pawn to e4, just sacrificing exchange on f8. And the point after the series of exchange is that you can see that bishop here is actually trapped here behind the pawn chain. And so it's really difficult to actually get the bishop into the play. And so this is just a long-term sacrifice, right? That fits into the first guideline that we talk about in the video, which is sacrificing exchange in order to clog up your opponent's position right here. In fact, white here can be up material, but he's the one who is struggling with counterplay of his pieces, while black's already trying to match up the pawn with h5, h4, h3, and try to tear up white's position right here. Not to mention a minor piece on the king's side can already transfer to the king's side and actually cause chaos right there, and or to find a checkmate motifs. But the game continued in a very sensible way in white trying to find counterplay against the king's side right here. But after the move king h7, white is really hesitant to play queen take on h4, just because the entire h-file now is open. The queen can come to c5, let's say, rook to h8. This kind of principle, at least in 2007, at the time was actually very scary to give your opponent that kind of counterplay. And so Robert did not take the pawn on h4 and instead plays queen to f4, attacking the pawn on c7. But after queen to c5 right here, protecting the pawn on c7, we do see knight to b5. Again, queen to h4 leads to a very quick rook to h8. And after queen to f4, something like bishop to h6, for example, is actually very possible. And so Robert continues with knight to b5. Here after pawn takes g3, pawn takes g3, you can see that the page file is actually open for the rook to come in. He could not take here with the f-pawn because the pawn is actually pinned by the queen here. But as you can see, white is the one who is actually struggling to find counterplay, while black's already making so much progress on the h-file, improvement of his major pieces and his minor pieces, such that Robert felt compelled to sacrifice a pawn on g4 and eventually the knight to bring the rook to d5, attacking the queen. The idea, of course, if you play queen to e7, then there will be rook to f5, pawn to f5, queen to f5, I'll be winning this way, the knight is hanging. And if you block with the knight, the rook is hanging here on c8. But never had he thought that after bringing the rook to d5, he will be setting himself up for another sacrifice. And yes, this game is not just featuring a rook sacrifice or an exchange sacrifice, but also the sacrifice that we all love, regardless if you're a mature player or an expert player. Maxime in this position just plays queen takes d5. Just brilliant sacrifices after brilliant sacrifices. The point is after pawn takes d5, we do see bishop to e5. This bishop is heading towards h2. After queen to c1, we do see bishop to h2 check. And after king h1, we do see rook to h8. Lining up the rook against the king right here. The next move, if white is not careful, will be bishop to f4 check. And picking up the queen here on c1. And so the queen is forced to move. Robert move it to c4, where it prepares the move pawn to d6 with discovery check. But first, Maxime repeats like a boss and plays pawn to b5. Pawn to b5 is awesome, not just because it sacrifices yet another pawn, but also from positional view, you're trying to deflect the queen such that there will be no pawn to d6 check that we talked about just earlier. And so here black is free to do whatever he wants and he plays pawn to e3. Idea, of course, is to take on f2. And bishop to g3 checkmate. But here Robert continues to the correct move, he plays bishop to f3, giving another square for the king to run to, but also trying to take away the knight, which is very active here on the king's side. Again, white couldn't take on e3 just because he's setting himself up for the dark square check over here, and this will be probably losing if anything. But Maxime here continues with knight to f2 check. The idea of king to g2, we see bishop to h3 check, and that will not be good for white in this case. And so already Robert is forced to take on f2, and after king to g2, do you think the pawn could be stopped here? It turns out after bishop to g1, we can play king to f1, trying to prevent the pawn from promoting. And also if bishop to h3, we can just bishop to g2, we can defend in a more sensible way right here, and just rely on the queen to give a perpetual check or whatever. But guess what? Robert Fontaine did not find this move, He instead plays queen to c6, desperate counterplay to try and perpetual check black king, next move. But here I'm afraid there will be no next move anymore for white, just because of a serious forcing move that leads to a checkmate. Can you find that move? You want to pause the video? But the move right here is rook to h2 check, forcing the king to go to g3. If king to f1, there will be bishop to h3 check that we talked about earlier. And so king to g3. And then Maxime continues with an under promotion to a knight with check. And it's a key move because had he promote to a queen right here, there will be a perpetual check on c7. But promoting a knight gives a check, so the king has to move. He's forced to go to f4. And after rook to h4, king to g5. Again, king to e5 leads to a checkmate here on d4. But then after bishop to e3, this is just another sacrifice here on h4. It's fun to see that there's another sacrifice here. And the point is, after the king takes, we see g5 check. And after king h5, we do see knight g3 with check. And this is where Robert Fontaine actually threw in the towel. Because after king h6, it's just g4 checkmate. He's not going to see through that. And chose to resign a move earlier. Now, whether or not this is an Immortal game, you tell me. But I learned that chess is not just about good move, it is about psychology, right? Part of it is psychology to make your opponent suffer throughout the rest of the game so that he does not make the best move and crack in the end. As we can see in this position, Robert can actually play king to f1 and he's probably fine, he's probably defending. But due to desperate measure of looking for counterplay, he messed up the move order and naturally get himself into a very devastating checkmate that ended up in this position. I mean, Maxime probably made the guy suffer from move 12 right here in this position in the opening, right to move 40. And so I think this is just simply incredible. Right, so that's first game, let's just move on to the second one. On the second game, we have Maxime Vachier Lagrave facing off against Rustam Kasimdzhanov. If you're not familiar, Rustam Kasimdzhanov is not only Fabiano Caruana's second, but also a world champion in around 2004. And so definitely a strong matchup right here. Rustam as black here plays pawn to g3, and here in this position you can pause the video and see what did Maxime play. Keep in mind Maxime is actually down 2 pawns right here. Maxime in this position plays rook to h5 to sacrifice in exchange, and after the recapture, the point is we can actually have the open g-file and a very strong attack here on g7. The only way to prevent him from losing the bishop is knight to g6, blocking the g-file, but Maxime is not done. He plays knight to f5, double attacking the bishop. The point is, after bishop h6, queen h6, this is probably devastating here on g7, and if you take on f5, that's basically checkmate. And so Rustam correctly plays bishop to f6. But here's the problem, right? After knight to d6, forking the rook, rook c6, knight e8, bishop e8, we get our exchange back, and we're no longer down 2 pawns. And the cherry on top is that Black's position looks like crap here, and seems like he's about to crack anytime soon. Maxime of course did not trade the queen and plays queen h2, but after pawn to h4, rook to g2, there is a defensive setup where Black can actually defend and counter-attack at the same time. The engine suggested queen to d4, where let's say after bishop to c1, which is a nothing move, it is Black who sacrificed in exchange and threatened to mate here on the diagonal. But it is then again one of those cases, right? When it's really hard to play queen to d4 when you already attack on the king's side right here. And so Rustam actually first plays bishop to c3, and after this we play check, bishop to c1 just blocking the check. Of course the bishop here doesn't have any longer purpose on h6, so bringing it back to block the check is also good. Furthermore, we can actually just switch place with the queen here as a vanguard to actually just checkmate Black in this position. Of course, don't forget as well that the knight is pinned. Next one will be queen to h4 or something to just win material. Rustam continues with queen to f3, and after rook to g1, king h7, we do see queen to b8 for Maxime. Attacking the bishop, bishop moves, and then queen to d8. So Maxime is really good at this thing, right? That kind of goes without saying. But he is one instance at the king's side attacking, and next is already on the queen's side, and then heading over to the center to actually launch an attack on the king's side if possible. As we can see, it's very difficult for Rustam to continue finding counterplay as the pressure only mounts on him, not Maxime. Maxime is just smooth sailing over here, no matter how we look at it. In fact, few moves from now will show you how tragic this position is for Black to defend, such that Maxime actually has the time to actually take the pawn on the rim of the board, far on the queen's side, and actually is able to reach this position where, Black just doesn't really have counterplay, and in this position, Black resigned the game. And it all comes back to this position, right, when Maxime actually decided to sacrifice an exchange here on h5, regardless of what the engine says the best move is. But the point is we're following the guidelines of sacrifice and exchange, right? Where we're trying to get rid of the defender of the Black's king right here. And so I think this game is just excellently played by Maxime to go for a win. Had he not sacrificed an exchange right here, perhaps it will be more difficult to win. The very next game that we're going to feature is from a blitz game, between MVL and Kramnik. Now again, although this is a blitz game, it does show you when you should have a killer instinct to sacrifice in exchange. And of course, it fits to the guideline that we talked about in the last video. In this position, Maxime plays pawn takes b4. After queen takes b4, we do see pawn takes d5. But as all the players will just play knight to d5, pawn to d5, or bishop to d5 here, Kramnik plays a little bit differently. He plays pawn to b2. Can you find a continuation that Maxime went for right here? Hopefully you see pawn to c6 is a winning move right here. The point is, after the exchange, even though white is technically down in material, he has a passed pawn right here that can be pushed to a queen. The next play will be rook to b1, try to support the pawn through the b file right here. So Kramnik plays queen to d4, but after rook to b1, bishop to d6, trying to push e5 right here and cause white some difficulty. Of course, Maxime just took and plays rook to b5. The threat is clear. Rook takes c5 or queen takes c5 is on the tap. And after rook to c8, first place knight to c4 attacking the queen. Queen to d4, we do see knight to b6. Now forking the rook, getting our exchange back. But on the process, we get a passed pawn that we're going to push to win here. And the rest, I believe, is just a very simple process where we took the exchange and then push the passed pawn, take the free pawn if we can, take another free pawn, take another free pawn, and then in this position, Kramnik just resign. But this sacrifice of an exchange is basically in the guideline of pushing your passed pawn or your pawn of alliance to actually promote to a queen. That requires your opponent to sacrifice a piece back in order to stop the pawn. Hopefully that's clear to you. Let's move on to the next game. The fourth game actually features a game in the Olympiad between Maxime Vachier Lagrave and Sergei Tiviakov. Probably you've never heard of Tiviakov because he's one of the players from Announce Generation, and most of the players from Announce Generation have gone to retirement. But in this particular moment, we get to see Maxime play another beautiful game. Pause the video if you wanted to find the move that Maxime plays in the continuation. But in this position, Maxime plays rook to g3 check. And after the recapture, queen to h3 check. Now this is just in a guideline again of sacrifice and exchange to infiltrate on your enemy's territory. In essence, trying to get rid of your enemy's defense by sacrificing exchange. Now probably Maxime is winning one pawn for the exchange right here, but that's never the problem. The problem is it's very difficult for white to defend. For example, knight here on b3 is attacked, but after rook to c3 we see queen to b1, trying to get queen to e1 check, followed by knight to d4, knight to b4. Of course, knight to b4 has to be supported by the pawn on a5 or something, but you get the point, right? Slow expansion to actually suffocate your opponents to death here. In fact, after knight to c1, to defend the first rank of the check or whatever, Maxime quickly jumps with the knight to d4 because the knight is no longer protecting it, and after this position, it does not matter if white is up in exchange. White is just going to be checkmated if he plays knight to f3 and queen to d2. Now the game continues for a bit, but the infiltration is where there's nothing that white can do to actually help this kind of position, and he's just losing all the pawns in the process. Now if you ask me whether Maxime can actually see all the move from when he sacrificed rook on g3 to this specific move, I would say no. But the fact remains that you can always sacrifice an exchange to get an infiltration in your enemy's camp. There's no point in holding on to the material if you cannot win. And even though if Maxime can only see up until this point, he intuitively knows that he will actually get the rest of the attack using the rest of the minor pieces right here. I mean these minor pieces, but okay. Hopefully that is clear to you as well. But let's move on to the last game. Now for the final game, we're just going to go into the French Championship again. But this is when Maxime is a little bit older than he was in the first game that we cover in this video. But it is in this position that I think Maxime plays a brilliant move. And I think everyone can actually just follow up right here, as this one will be one of the easier guesses considering, he has a weak dark square diagonal, his e-file is half open. Would you like to pause the video and actually find it yourself? Find a continuation until he resign. Until black resign, that is. But the move that Maxime plays is rook to d7. This move of moving your piece just one square short before exchanging, I think it's just pretty sexy. On top of it, we do have 3 pieces attacking it. And so I really think that this is just amazing move that we all should learn and really just keep in our head so we can apply it in our next game or in our next tournament. But the point is, after bishop takes d7, we do see knight to d7 check. Of course, if captured on d7, queen h8 checkmate. But king to g8, as the game progresses, we see knight to f6 check. The king cannot come to the dark square diagonal because, of course, checkmate is going to ensue. But even if king to f8 right here, we just play knight to h5 again, and checkmate is just going to ensue. The same thing. Pawn to h5, we do see queen to h8 checkmate. And just in this position, Igor Nataf, Maxime's opponent here, resign. But with that said, we've come to the end of the video. We've covered one of the strongest players in the world who likes to sacrifice the exchange and occasionally the queen to reach a crazy position that he could fight for a win. And so really with this video, I hope that you can really incorporate some of the guidelines and patterns of sacrificing exchange to your own game, so that you can also be stronger that way. Again, if you enjoyed the video, please press the like button so we'll understand what kind of content you actually enjoy. And if you enjoyed very much, please comment down below as well to see if we can actually do the same thing for Magnus Carlsen or other top players in the world. But otherwise, thanks for watching. See you soon.